Beneath the highland skies of northern Ethiopia, the land holds its secrets in silence. Jagged mountains rise like sentinels, their peaks lost in drifting clouds. Valleys lie green and fertile, carved by rivers that have flowed since the dawn of memory. In this ancient soil, the earth whispers of forgotten kings, of cities once bright with trade, of monuments that pierce the heavens yet stand abandoned, shrouded in mystery. What makes a civilization vanish into obscurity? What turns a mighty empire into little more than scattered stones and faded legends? For centuries, travelers passed through these lands, oblivious that beneath their feet lay the remnants of one of Africa's greatest powers. Rome knew its name. India sent ships to its harbors. Merchants carried its gold and ivory to distant markets. And yet today, the kingdom of Aksum lies hidden in the shadows of history. This is not merely the story of a forgotten empire, it is the story of ambition carved in stone, of faith reshaping destiny, of power rising from the highlands and reaching out across seas. To uncover it, we must go back to the beginning, when the mountains of Ethiopia cradled a people destined for greatness. The Ethiopian plateau is no ordinary landscape. From the air, it stretches like a vast green fortress, a natural citadel lifted thousands of feet above the surrounding lowlands. It is here, in this cradle of highlands, that the first stirrings of the Aksumite civilization began. Centuries before Christ, scattered communities tilled the soil and herded their cattle in the northern highlands. They lived close to the rhythms of the earth, their lives bound to the cycles of rain and harvest. Yet the land itself offered more than mere survival. Rich volcanic soil gave birth to crops that could sustain cities. Rivers provided water, while the mountains formed natural defenses. Geography, as it so often does, shaped destiny. To the north lay the Red Sea, a gateway to the world. Beyond it, Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. To the east, the vast Indian Ocean, where ships rode the monsoon winds toward India. Aksum's people were not isolated, they stood at a crossroads of continents. Archaeologists trace the roots of Aksum to a blend of influences. The Sabaeans, traders from across the Red Sea in southern Arabia, left inscriptions and temples in these lands, mingling with local traditions. From this meeting of cultures, something new emerged, a kingdom that would one day claim dominion over both shores of the Red Sea. Imagine the scene. In the 1st century CE, small settlements began to grow into organized towns. Markets filled with salt, livestock, and grain. Traders carried incense and ivory through dusty caravan routes, linking the African interior to the ports on the coast. The people of Aksum were already looking outward, their ambitions carried on the backs of camels and the hulls of ships. The rise of Aksum was not sudden, but steady. The land gave them strength, their position gave them opportunity. By the time Rome reached the height of its power, Aksum was no longer a collection of villages. It was a kingdom, crowned with rulers who claimed descent from divine ancestors. But the mountains held more than kingship, they held stone. Towering obelisks, carved from single blocks of granite, began to pierce the skies above Aksumite towns. These were not crude markers, they were engineering marvels, weighing hundreds of tons, yet raised in defiance of gravity. Each one was a statement, declaring, "We are here. We are eternal." Travelers who approached the highland capital could not ignore them. Against the backdrop of rugged mountains, the obelisks rose like a forest of stone spears. Even today, their presence is haunting, silent guardians of a city long gone. But power is never built on stone alone. The lifeblood of Aksum flowed through its control of trade. From the highlands came gold, ivory, and precious stones. From the coast, ports like Adulis became bustling harbors where Roman merchants docked their ships. Imagine the sight, vessels from Alexandria laden with glass and wine, Indian traders unloading spices and silks, African caravans bringing ivory tusks that gleamed in the sunlight. Adulis was not a backwater, it was one of the great ports of the ancient world, a rival to the harbors of Arabia and the Mediterranean. The Greeks wrote of Aksum. The Romans traded with it. The Persians watched it warily. In the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st century merchant guide, the name of Aksum appears alongside the great powers of the age. Already, the world recognized the highland kingdom as a force of consequence. And yet, the Aksumites were more than traders, they were builders of identity. Their inscriptions record kings who extended their reach deep into the interior of Africa, commanding tribute from distant peoples. In time, their rulers would mint their own coins, stamped with royal faces and symbols of faith. These coins traveled far beyond Ethiopia, discovered even in India, a silent testimony to the reach of Aksum's influence. But the first chapter of Aksum's story is not its height, nor its conversion to a new faith, nor its wars with mighty neighbors. It is the slow awakening of a people, the gathering of power in the highlands, the carving of stone monuments that defied time, and the rise of a kingdom that stood between Africa and the wider world. As night falls over the Ethiopian plateau, one can almost hear the echoes, the chants of priests at mountain shrines, the hammering of masons shaping obelisks, the cries of traders driving their camels toward the coast. The empire is not yet at its zenith, but the foundations have been laid. From these beginnings, a forgotten empire will rise to challenge the world's greatest powers, shaping the destiny of a continent and leaving behind mysteries still unsolved. The winds of history are stirring. And in the next chapter, Aksum will not merely survive, it will ascend. The northern highlands of Ethiopia, around the first centuries of the Common Era, pulse with new energy. Villages clustered on fertile ridges, and markets bustled where mountain paths converged. What had once been scattered communities now coalesced into something larger, a kingdom drawing its strength from both the soil beneath its feet and the seas that lapped at its distant shores. At the heart of this transformation lay a city, Aksum. Nestled in the Tigray highlands, its valleys watered by seasonal streams, the settlement grew into a capital that would anchor an empire. To approach Aksum was to see a place unlike any other in Africa of the time. Terraced fields stretched across the slopes, green with teff and barley. Herds of cattle moved slowly along dusty roads, while stone houses rose in clusters, their walls mortared with earth, their flat roofs looking out toward the horizon. But above them all, piercing the sky, stood the first obelisks. These stelae were more than markers of graves, they were symbols of kingship. Each was carved from a single monolith of granite, some over 20 meters tall. Their faces were inscribed with windows and doors, an architectural illusion suggesting the permanence of royal palaces turned to stone. In their shadow, the people of Aksum gathered for ceremonies, offerings, and proclamations. To live in Aksum was to live under the watchful gaze of ancestors immortalized in granite. Yet Aksum's strength was not rooted in stone alone, it was in the crown. The kings of Aksum styled themselves not as mere chiefs but as negus, rulers whose authority stretched beyond their valleys. They traced their ancestry to divine origins, binding religion and kingship into one. Inscriptions carved into rocks in Guizi, the ancient language of Ethiopia, proclaimed their victories and their reach. These were rulers who demanded tribute from the lands beyond their mountains, from peoples of the lowlands and the high plains. Power in Aksum grew hand in hand with trade. The highlands yielded fertile harvests, but it was commerce that fed the kingdom's ambition. From the interior came ivory, gleaming tusks carried by caravans across rugged landscapes. From the lowlands came gold, frankincense, and exotic hides. In exchange, Aksum's markets absorbed Roman glass, Mediterranean wine, and Arabian textiles. The city of Adulis, its great port on the Red Sea, became the artery through which the empire's lifeblood flowed. Ships from Egypt and Arabia anchored in its harbors, unloading goods from distant lands, while Aksumite traders prepared their caravans for the journey inland. Adulis was no ordinary port, it was a meeting place of worlds. Greek merchants wrote about it with admiration. Roman envoys passed through, carrying diplomatic gifts to the Aksumite court. Indian traders arrived with sacks of pepper, cinnamon, and silk, their ships riding the rhythm of the monsoon winds. To stand in Adulis was to feel the pulse of 3 continents converging in one place. And behind it all, rising high above the sea, stood the power of Aksum. As trade flourished, Aksum's rulers sought permanence in coinage. Around the 3rd century, they began minting their own currency, gold, silver, and bronze coins stamped with royal portraits. In Africa south of the Sahara, this was unprecedented. These coins did more than facilitate commerce, they announced Aksum's arrival among the great economies of the ancient world. On one side, a king's face gazed out with regal authority, on the other, symbols of faith and prosperity marked the promise of the realm. These coins traveled far beyond the empire's borders. Archaeologists have found them in India, scattered in hordes across Arabia, even in distant Rome. Each coin carried not only wealth but identity, a message that Aksum stood as a power to be reckoned with. The birth of Aksum, however, was not without conflict. To the north lay Nubia and the kingdoms of the Nile, proud civilizations with their own legacies. To the east, Arabia and its city-states vied for dominance of the Red Sea trade. Aksum's rulers had to navigate a delicate balance, allying with some, warring with others, always guarding their control over the seas and caravan routes. The stakes were immense, for to lose the Red Sea was to lose the world. Yet in these centuries, Aksum prevailed. The mountains gave it a stronghold, the seas gave it a highway, its kings gave it vision. Slowly, the name of Aksum spread across maps and chronicles. The Roman geographer Claudius Ptolemy included it among the important realms of Africa. Merchants whispered of its gold and ivory in the markets of Alexandria. By the 3rd century, Aksum was no longer a rising power, it was a kingdom that stood shoulder to shoulder with Rome, Persia, and India. And still, it grew. New monuments rose in the capital, larger and more ambitious than before. The stele reached ever higher, culminating in a monolith more than 30 meters tall, the largest stone ever erected in the ancient world. Though it now lies broken, toppled centuries ago, its sheer size speaks of a kingdom that had mastered engineering and ambition alike. The streets of Aksum bustled with artisans and traders, priests and soldiers. The air carried the scent of incense, the clatter of coin, the chants of worship. In this city, kings plotted campaigns, merchants calculated profits, and stonemasons carved the eternal symbols of a dynasty destined to shape Africa's history. Yet the story of Aksum's birth is only the opening act. The empire was strong, but its destiny was not only to trade and to build. Faith would soon sweep across its mountains, changing the heart of its kings and the very symbols etched on its coins. The obelisks would give way to churches, and the gods of stone would yield to the cross. But before the empire embraced its new religion, it would reach for supremacy across seas and deserts. The next chapter of Aksum's story is one of expansion, ambition, and the forging of an empire that stood astride continents. The city of Aksum was not only the heart of a kingdom, it was a theater of stone, where power was performed in monuments that defied time itself. To walk its streets in the 3rd and 4th centuries was to move through a landscape where the dead and the living shared the same space, bound together by towers that pierced the Ethiopian sky. At first sight, the obelisks, known as stelae, must have seemed otherworldly. Rising from the earth in fields of granite, they stood in ranks, some small and unadorned, others vast and elaborately carved. Their surfaces bore the shapes of windows, doors, and floors, as though entire palaces had been frozen in stone. The tallest soared over 30 meters, its shadow stretching across the city like the arm of eternity. Even the ruins that remain today inspire awe. But for the people of Aksum, these were not ruins, they were living monuments, proclaiming the power of kings and the permanence of their legacy. The stelae were more than tomb markers. They were declarations, messages of authority carved for gods, ancestors, and future generations alike. When a king of Aksum died, his resting place was not hidden away in anonymity. Instead, his grave was crowned with a monolith that turned memory into spectacle. The earth beneath Aksum became a vast necropolis, while above ground the city became a skyline of stone giants. Imagine the labor it demanded. Thousands of workers toiled in the quarries outside the city, chiseling granite blocks with iron tools. Songs echoed in the heat as teams dragged the monoliths across the rugged highlands, hauled by ropes and wooden sledges. At the construction sites, wooden scaffolding rose like skeletal forests, surrounding each obelisk as it was prepared for its final ascent. Then came the moment of peril, the raising of the monolith. With ropes, levers, and sheer human strength, the stone was pulled upright, swaying like a mast in the wind before locking into the earth with a thunderous finality. A cheer would rise from the crowds. Another king had etched his name into eternity. The symbolism was layered. The carved windows and doors etched onto the stelae were not mere decorations, they suggested the architecture of the living world, translated into the permanence of stone. Death was not an end but a continuation, the palace of the king recreated as a monument, ensuring that he ruled forever, even from beneath the earth. The obelisks also served as visual propaganda. They dominated the skyline, visible from miles away, signaling to subjects and visitors alike that Aksum was no ordinary kingdom. It was a land of divine kingship, where rulers could command stone itself to obey. When Roman or Persian envoys entered the city, these monuments would have stood as silent ambassadors, more persuasive than any speech or treaty. And the stelae were only one element of Aksum's grandeur. Around them rose temples and palaces. Stone platforms supported royal compounds, their walls adorned with bright colors and geometric patterns. The city's streets wound between courtyards and workshops, where artisans hammered metal, wove textiles, and carved intricate designs from ivory. Markets overflowed with goods brought in from distant lands: Egyptian glass, Arabian incense, Indian spices. Aksum was not a hidden city, it was a hub, a magnet that drew people from across continents. Yet amid this splendor, the stele remained the city's defining feature. Foreign writers who described Aksum often marveled at its monuments. Even centuries later, medieval Arab travelers recounted tales of the city of giants, where stones larger than houses stood upright in solemn ranks. To them, these monuments seemed the work of supernatural beings. For the Aksumites, however, they were the handiwork of human ambition, ambition to claim the heavens, ambition to outlast time. But time itself is a merciless judge. The largest obelisk of Aksum, an extraordinary monolith over 33 meters tall, now lies shattered in pieces, as though struck down by divine wrath. Scholars debate whether it fell during its erection or centuries later, perhaps toppled by an earthquake. Its fragments, lying heavy on the ground, remind us of the delicate line between human triumph and collapse. Even the mightiest monuments can stumble. Still, many obelisks endure, their surfaces weathered but unbroken. Standing among them today is to feel both awe and silence, the kind of silence that presses against the skin, as though the stones themselves are listening. They have outlasted kingdoms and empires, carrying whispers of a past too vast for memory alone. The obelisks also reveal a society in transition. Beneath their bases, archaeologists have uncovered tombs filled with offerings, pottery, tools, and ornaments placed beside the dead. These practices speak of beliefs rooted in the ancient world, of gods and spirits tied to the earth. Yet even as these traditions thrived, winds of change began to sweep across Aksum. Merchants carried not only goods but ideas. Faiths from across the seas began to enter the highlands, challenging the old ways. But that moment had not yet come. In the 3rd and early 4th centuries, Aksum was at the height of its traditional power. Its kings, immortalized in granite, oversaw a city that stood as one of the wonders of Africa. The stele fields were their eternal court, each monument a voice of stone proclaiming that the kingdom of Aksum was destined to endure. The city of obelisks was more than a capital, it was a stage, a spectacle, and a promise. For centuries, its stones would guard the memory of kings whose names are scarcely remembered today, but whose ambition still towers against the Ethiopian sky. Yet even as the stele rose, change loomed on the horizon. Across the Red Sea, new powers gathered strength. New faiths prepared to sweep into the highlands. And soon, the kingdom of Aksum would no longer define itself through tombs and obelisks alone, but through battles, conversions, and empires claimed beyond its borders. The stones still stand, but the story moves forward. From monuments of the dead, the saga of Aksum shifts to the living waters of the Red Sea, where fleets of ships carried the empire's ambition to distant shores. The city of obelisks had made its statement, now Aksum would prove it on the stage of the world. The highland city of Aksum, with its obelisks of stone and courts of kings, was the heart of the empire, but its pulse was felt most strongly on the water. For while the mountains gave Aksum strength, it was the Red Sea that gave it reach. Here, where Africa brushed against Arabia, the kingdom commanded not only land but waves, transforming itself from a highland power into a maritime empire. The coastline of the Red Sea in the 3rd and 4th centuries was alive with motion. Dhows with triangular sails skimmed the waters, their wooden hulls creaking under the weight of cargo. Roman merchant ships, larger and heavier, anchored in harbors where languages from across the known world mingled in the salty air. And at the center of it all stood Adulis, the great port of Aksum, gateway between the highlands and the world. Adulis was no sleepy harbor. It was a cauldron of trade and culture. Here, Ivory tusks gleamed like polished towers, piled high in warehouses bound for the markets of Alexandria. Caravans from the African interior arrived with gold dust, obsidian blades, and exotic animals, leopards, giraffes, even elephants, destined for foreign courts. In return, ships unloaded amphorae filled with Roman wine, jars of olive oil, and glassware that sparkled in the sun. From India came silks and pepper, from Arabia came incense and myrrh, their perfumes drifting through the crowded streets. To walk through Adulis was to see a living map of the ancient world. The Aksumites understood that trade was more than profit, it was power. Whoever controlled Adulis and the Red Sea routes controlled the arteries of empire. Rome knew this. So did Persia. Both sought influence in these waters, for the Red Sea was the highway that bound the Mediterranean to the riches of India. But while Rome's legions marched across Europe, and Persia's kings ruled from palaces in Ctesiphon, Aksum watched the waves. The kings of the highlands knew that their destiny lay in mastery of the sea. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek merchant's guide written in the 1st century, described Adulis as a thriving hub, a place where the wealth of Africa and Arabia converged. By the 3rd century, this had only grown. Roman traders spoke of the wealth of Aksum, of kings who could muster fleets and armies at will, of an empire that sat astride one of the world's great crossroads. The Aksumite fleet was not an afterthought, it was a symbol of ambition. Dhows and larger vessels sailed under royal command, carrying not only goods but soldiers. With control of the Red Sea, Aksum could project its power far beyond its mountains. It was not confined to being a silent partner in trade, it was a player, or ruler of seas. And with the sea came war. To the north, the kingdom of Himyar in southern Arabia rose as both a trading rival and a strategic threat. Situated across the narrow Bab el-Mandeb Strait, Himyar's ports offered competition to Adulis, and its rulers vied for dominance of the incense trade. Conflict was inevitable. Aksumite kings launched expeditions across the Red Sea, their ships cutting through the waves with sails taut in the monsoon winds. Imagine the sight, fleets of vessels landing on Arabian shores, warriors disembarking with shields and spears, banners fluttering in the desert sun. For the first time, Aksum stepped onto foreign soil, declaring itself not only a trading partner but a conquering power. These campaigns were not mere raids. They were statements, proof that the Red Sea belonged to Aksum. Inscriptions carved in Guizi record victories against Arabian foes, boasting of tribute extracted and kings subdued. At its height, Aksum did not just trade with Arabia, it ruled parts of it. For a time, the kingdom controlled the western shores of the Arabian Peninsula, claiming both sides of the sea as its domain. This dual empire was extraordinary. Few kingdoms in the ancient world straddled continents, commanding lands in both Africa and Asia. Aksum was among them. Its highland kings could look across the waters and know that their reign extended beyond the horizon. The Red Sea had become an Aksumite lake. The political consequences were immense. Rome relied on Red Sea trade for spices, silk, and other luxuries from India. By securing the waters, Aksum positioned itself as Rome's indispensable ally. Roman coins poured into Aksumite markets, while Aksumite coins traveled back across the Mediterranean. Diplomacy flourished. Envoys moved between Aksum and Roman courts, their exchanges sealed not only by words but by the steady movement of ships. Persia, too, watched carefully. The Sassanid kings, rivals of Rome, sought to control the sea lanes from the Persian Gulf to India. But Aksum's command of the Red Sea posed a challenge to their ambitions. In the quiet calculations of empire, Aksum had become more than a trading state, it was a strategic fulcrum, a kingdom whose decisions shaped the balance of power between giants. Life in Aksum itself reflected this maritime might. The capital buzzed with foreign visitors, Greek-speaking merchants, Arabian envoys, Indian traders with their bright textiles. Streets echoed with a dozen languages. Inscriptions in Aksum were sometimes written not only in Guizi but in Greek, the lingua franca of trade, signaling the cosmopolitan nature of the kingdom. This was not an isolated highland people, it was an empire connected to the world, its horizons stretching far beyond its mountains. Yet the Red Sea was not merely an avenue of wealth, it was a stage of risk. Storms could destroy fleets, piracy could cripple commerce, and rival kingdoms could close ports. Aksum's prosperity depended on vigilance. The kings understood this, investing in both military expeditions and diplomatic alliances. Their goal was simple: to ensure that the Red Sea remained theirs. By the early 4th century, Aksum's supremacy on the Red Sea was secure. Its fleets guarded the straits, its armies had marched in Arabia, and its ports bustled with trade that fed not only its own prosperity but that of empires far beyond its borders. The Highland Kingdom had become a maritime superpower, a bridge between Africa and the wider world. And yet, as Aksum tightened its grip on trade and expanded across the waters, another transformation was quietly unfolding. Ideas traveled with goods, and beliefs moved with merchants. Across the Red Sea, a new faith was spreading from the Roman world, carried by whispers, traders, and missionaries. Soon, it would cross the waters and take root in the highlands, reshaping the very soul of Aksum. The kings had mastered the seas. But the next challenge would not come from foreign rivals or storms of the ocean. It would come from within, from the cross, from faith, and from a vision that would redefine what it meant to rule an empire. The markets of Aksum were alive with color, sound, and smell. In the capital's bustling squares and in the warehouses of Adulis, the empire's wealth revealed itself in dazzling abundance. Gleaming ivory tusks stood like towers, stacked in rows as though forming a forest of pale stone. Traders unfurled bright silks from India, their sheen catching the African sun. Amphorae of Roman wine clinked together as porters carried them on their backs, while jars of olive oil and glass goblets sparkled in the shade of wooden stalls. Over it all rose the aroma of incense and spices, a perfume that spoke of distant lands. Aksum had become a marketplace of continents. From the heart of Africa came ivory, prized by artisans in Rome who carved it into statues, combs, and ornaments for the wealthy elite. From the mines of Nubia and the Ethiopian highlands flowed gold, dust, nuggets, and worked jewelry, currency for empires and crowns for rulers. Exotic hides, rhinoceros horn, and even live animals were loaded onto ships, elephants destined for Roman circuses, giraffes and leopards for royal menageries. From Arabia, frankincense and myrrh passed through Aksum's hands, sacred resins burned in temples from Alexandria to Antioch. Every object, every scent, every gleam carried a story of lands far apart, now converging under Aksum's watch. The lifeblood of this exchange was Adulis. Standing on the Eritrean coast, it was more than a port, it was Aksum's window to the world. Here the monsoon winds dictated the rhythm of trade, drawing ships from the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean in predictable cycles. When the summer winds blew northward, ships from India and Arabia swelled the harbor, their sails white against the horizon. Months later, when the winds reversed, they departed, laden with treasures bound for far-off markets. Greek-speaking merchants marveled at Adulis. One of them, whose record survives in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, described it as a center of wealth and a meeting point of nations. Centuries later, a traveler named Cosmas Indicopleustes, a Christian monk from Alexandria, would stand in its streets and call it one of the world's great harbors. Adulis was no provincial outpost, it was a cosmopolitan crossroads, its warehouses echoing with the shuffle of sandals, the crack of whips driving caravans inland, and the shouts of sailors calling across the water. From Adulis, caravans wound their way into the highlands. Long lines of camels carried goods across dry plains, then mules and oxen bore them up into the mountains, where Aksum awaited. The capital itself became a city of treasures. Gold coins stamped with the faces of kings glittered in the sunlight. Foreign envoys arrived bearing gifts for the court, silver from Persia, glass from Rome, pearls from the Persian Gulf. Aksumite kings, seated on thrones of ivory, looked out over a realm enriched not only by conquest but by commerce. The empire's coins were themselves ambassadors. First minted in the 3rd century, they became one of Aksum's proudest symbols. Struck in gold, silver, and bronze, they carried inscriptions in both Guizi and Greek, ensuring their circulation across cultural boundaries. On their obverse, the face of the king gazed with stern authority, on their reverse, symbols of prosperity or faith. Roman coins bore the faces of emperors like Constantine, Aksumite coins carried the visages of kings such as Endubis and Ezana. To hold one was to hold proof that Aksum was a peer to Rome, an empire confident in its power. And Rome did not treat Aksum as a distant curiosity. The Romans relied on its trade. In Alexandria, ivory from Aksum filled workshops where artisans carved statuettes of gods and intricate panels for furniture. Roman aristocrats drank wine poured from glass vessels shipped via Adulis. Gold from the highlands found its way into Roman coinage, feeding an economy that stretched from Britain to Syria. Even the amphitheaters of Rome echoed with the roars of Aksumite elephants, their presence turning the spectacles of the Colosseum into displays of imperial reach. Diplomatic ties followed naturally. Roman envoys traveled to Aksum, navigating the Red Sea to stand before its kings. Letters were exchanged between emperors and Aksumite rulers, words carried by the same winds that filled merchant sails. When the Roman Empire split into East and West, Aksum looked increasingly to Constantinople, forging ties with Byzantium. It was a partnership of necessity. Rome needed the Red Sea routes open, and Aksum needed Rome's markets and prestige. But Aksum was not a passive partner. Its rulers understood leverage. By controlling Adulis, by projecting naval power across the Red Sea, they positioned themselves as gatekeepers. No Roman ship could safely sail to India without Aksum's goodwill. No caravan of ivory or gold could leave Africa without passing through their realm. Aksum had turned geography into advantage, transforming mountains and seas into instruments of dominance. Yet wealth carried dangers. With prosperity came rivals. Arabia's Himyarite kingdom sought to divert trade into its own ports. Pirates lurked along the coasts, preying on merchant vessels. Even internal unrest threatened the flow of goods, for caravans could not cross lands plagued by rebellion. To defend its position, Aksum's kings built armies and fleets, ensuring that their wealth was matched by strength. And still, the empire prospered. By the 4th century, Aksum stood as one of the 4 great powers of the known world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Its name was spoken in markets from Alexandria to Ceylon. Coins bearing its kings' faces were found buried in hoards as far as southern India. To the people of the Mediterranean, Aksum was not some distant, exotic realm. It was a partner, a competitor, and, at times, a rival. The capital mirrored this wealth. In Aksum itself, the steely fields stood beside new palaces. Courtyards rang with the laughter of nobles and the debates of merchants. The treasury overflowed with tribute from conquered lands and profits from trade. Gold gleamed in ornaments, ivory in carvings, and imported silks in the garments of the elite. Aksum was no longer simply a city of stone monuments, it was a living empire, nourished by the arteries of trade. And yet, beneath the glitter of gold and ivory, change was coming. Among the Roman goods that entered Aksum were not only wine and glass but ideas. Traders and missionaries carried stories of a crucified Savior, a faith that was sweeping the Mediterranean world. In the highland courts, whispers of this new belief began to spread. Some kings listened. Some resisted. But in time, the wealth of Aksum would be joined by faith, and the face of its empire would change forever. For now, the markets still rang with trade, and the coins of Aksum clinked against those of Rome. But soon, the cross would rise above the obelisks, and Aksum would step into a new chapter, one where faith and empire became inseparable. In the early 4th century, Aksum's kings still walked among the stelae of their ancestors, presiding over rituals rooted in the old gods of the highlands. Sacrifices were offered at temples, incense burned to spirits, and kings proclaimed their power in inscriptions carved on stone. Yet the winds that carried ships across the Red Sea brought more than silks and spices. They carried ideas born in distant Jerusalem, spread by Roman roads, nurtured by persecution, and now embraced by emperors. Christianity was no longer a hidden faith. It was rising, and soon it would find a throne in Aksum. The story begins with a boy. His name was Frumentius. Along with his brother Adesius, he was taken from Tyre, a Phoenician city on the Mediterranean. Shipwrecked on the Red Sea and brought inland, Frumentius grew up within the Aksumite court. Here, among kings and nobles, he learned the language of the highlands, observed the rituals of the old faith, and earned trust. But within him burned another loyalty, the faith of Christ. As he rose in influence, he began to encourage the presence of Christian merchants in Aksum, giving them land to build places of worship, planting seeds that would one day transform the empire. When Frumentius traveled to Alexandria, he sought permission for more than trade. He stood before Athanasius, the patriarch of the city, one of Christianity's towering figures, and asked that Aksum be given its own bishop. Athanasius agreed, and appointed Frumentius himself. Thus, the boy who had once been a captive returned as a spiritual leader, carrying the cross back into the highlands. Under King Ezana, Aksum embraced Christianity. Ezana's reign marked a turning point as profound as any conquest. His inscriptions tell the story of a king who once dedicated victories to the old gods, but who, in time, declared himself a servant of the Lord of Heaven. The obelisks still stood, but now new symbols appeared, crosses carved on coins, churches rising where temples once stood. A kingdom of stone monuments became a kingdom of faith. Ezana's conversion was more than personal devotion, it was a declaration of empire. To adopt Christianity aligned Aksum with the newly Christian Roman world, forging bonds of belief across the seas. No longer merely trading partners, Aksum and Rome became spiritual kin. The Mediterranean and the highlands of Africa were linked not just by ships but by shared worship. In this, Aksum became the first great African power to embrace Christianity as a state religion, centuries before many parts of Europe. The change reshaped daily life. In the capital, chants of Guizi hymns echoed through new churches. Priests stood before carved wooden altars, raising the cross high as incense drifted upward in curling tendrils. Baptisms took place in rivers, their waters now sanctified. The festivals of the old gods gave way to celebrations of saints and martyrs, and the rhythm of the Christian calendar began to guide the seasons of Aksumite life. Coins bore witness to this transformation. Where once they showed the crescent or the disk of the sun, now they displayed the cross. The currency of Aksum was not only a medium of exchange, it was a message, carried in pockets and purses across continents. The kings of Aksum served Christ. To find these coins in India or Arabia was to glimpse the spread of faith alongside commerce, a union of belief and wealth. But the adoption of Christianity was also political theater. Ezana used the new faith to cement his authority. By casting himself as God's chosen ruler, he elevated kingship from earthly power to divine mission. Victories in battle were now framed as triumphs of the cross. Enemies were not only defeated, they were subdued under the banner of heaven. Religion and empire became inseparable, each strengthening the other. Aksum's embrace of Christianity was not without resistance. The old gods still lingered in the highlands, their shrines and sacrifices kept alive by those who resisted change. But Ezana's authority was absolute, and the alignment with Rome gave his choice weight. Over time, the new faith took root, spreading from nobles to commoners, from cities to villages, until the cross became as much a part of Aksum's landscape as its mountains and rivers. Archaeological traces reveal this transformation. Foundations of early basilicas, with apses facing east and stone altars at their heart, stand where temples once rose. Crosses etched into stone blocks, carved onto walls, or painted onto pottery fragments mark the spread of the new faith. The Church of Mary of Zion, though rebuilt many times over the centuries, is said to trace its origins to this age, a spiritual center that tied the empire to a divine narrative. The conversion also reshaped Aksum's role in the world. It was no longer simply a kingdom of trade and stone monuments. It was now part of a global faith, bound to Rome and Byzantium by belief. Diplomats spoke of Aksum not only as a wealthy power but as a Christian ally. Missionaries set sail from its ports, carrying the gospel southward into Nubia and beyond. The empire became both a commercial and a spiritual crossroads. And yet, this new identity carried risks. Aligning with Christianity meant drawing the ire of those who did not share the faith. In Arabia, Himir's rulers clung to Judaism, setting the stage for clashes across the Red Sea. Persia, with its Zoroastrian tradition, eyed Aksum with suspicion as it grew closer to Byzantium. Religion added new layers to old rivalries, turning the Red Sea into a theater not only of trade but of faith. For Aksum's people, however, the transformation was profound. The obelisks still watched over the land, silent sentinels of an older age. But beside them rose churches filled with song. The markets still bustled with ivory and gold, but now coins bore the mark of the cross. The rhythms of life still followed the rains and harvests, but over them rang the bells of liturgy. Christianity had given Aksum a new crown. It was not carved of gold or ivory, nor raised like a monolith. It was a crown of faith, invisible yet enduring, binding kingship to eternity. Ezana's choice did not merely alter the religion of a people, it transformed the destiny of an empire. From this moment on, Aksum was not just an African power. It was a Christian empire, one of the first in the world. Its kings would wage wars not only for land but for belief. Its alliances would be shaped not only by trade but by faith. And in its chronicles, the reign of Ezana would be remembered not only for victories won but for a decision that turned the cross into the heart of a kingdom. The obelisks still cast their shadows, but Aksum's light now came from a new source. The age of stone had given way to the age of the cross. And soon, this faith would draw Aksum into struggles far greater than any it had known, struggles across deserts, across seas, across the very fault lines of belief that divided the ancient world. The Red Sea in the 5th and 6th centuries was no longer just a glittering highway of trade, it was a frontier of faith, a corridor where religions, kingdoms, and empires clashed like waves against rock. On one shore stood Christian Aksum, its kings proclaiming victory in the name of the cross. On the other lay the kingdom of Himyar in southern Arabia, where rulers embraced Judaism and cast wary eyes across the waters. Beyond them loomed Persia, Zoroastrian and powerful, determined to dominate the world's crossroads. Faith, politics, and commerce became inseparable, and the Red Sea turned into a chessboard where kings played for both souls and supremacy. In Aksum's capital, Ezana's successors presided over courts alive with strategy. Messengers from Byzantium arrived with gifts and pleas, urging Aksum to stand as an ally in Christ against Persian influence. Priests reminded the king that Aksum was no ordinary kingdom, it was God's chosen fortress in Africa, a bastion at the edge of Christendom. The stakes were no longer measured in gold or ivory, but in belief. To falter would mean surrendering the Red Sea to rivals who denied the cross. The flashpoint came in Himyar. Jewish kings there turned against Christians in their realm, sparking persecution that sent waves of horror across the Christian world. Refugees fled across the waters, bearing stories of massacre and desecrated churches. To Byzantium, this was a call to arms, but only Aksum, standing just across the sea, could act. And so, the kings of Aksum became crusaders before the age of crusades, wielding not only swords but the mantle of divine justice. Caleb, king of Aksum, answered the call. Chroniclers would later speak of him as a warrior for Christ, his reign defined by a campaign that carried Aksum's armies across the sea. From Adulis, fleets of ships set sail, massive vessels hewn from the forests of the highlands, their sails swelling with the monsoon winds. Imagine the sight, a fleet of war and faith, ivory-white sails against the horizon, carrying warriors armed with spears and conviction. When they landed in Himyar, battle followed swiftly. Aksumite soldiers clashed with Himyarite forces in desert valleys where the sun itself seemed to conspire against endurance. Dust clouds rose as men and horses charged, the clash of shields ringing across the sands. To the soldiers of Aksum, this was more than war, it was retribution for the blood of martyrs, a fight sanctified by heaven. Caleb's campaign succeeded. Himyar fell under Aksumite influence, and Christianity was restored, if only for a time. Chroniclers recorded the triumph as proof of Aksum's divine mission. Yet victory carried its own burdens. Governing across the sea was no simple task. Rebellion simmered, allies faltered, and Persia, watching from the east, saw opportunity in the shifting sands. Soon, Persian forces intervened, driving out Aksumite influence and tightening their grip on southern Arabia. This struggle marked both the height and the beginning of decline for Aksum's external power. For a brief moment, the empire stretched its reach beyond Africa, commanding armies across the sea, shaping the fate of kingdoms through war and faith. But each campaign drained resources, each fleet taxed the land, and each victory sparked new enemies. The deserts of Arabia became a graveyard of ambition, where Aksum's strength was tested to its limits. Still, the memory of Caleb's war endured, not only in chronicles but in legend. Ethiopian tradition remembered him as a saint, a king who set aside his crown after victory to retire as a monk, leaving worldly power for spiritual devotion. Whether history or myth, the story reflected the enduring link between crown and cross, between empire and faith. Back in Aksum, life carried on. Markets bustled, caravans arrived, and ships sailed. Yet the empire was now tied to conflicts far beyond its mountains. The choice to embrace Christianity had opened doors to alliances but also pulled Aksum into the struggles of empires greater than itself. The Red Sea, once a lifeline of wealth, was now a battleground of faith and power, and Aksum stood at its very heart. For the people of the highlands, the wars across the sands were both distant and close. Distant, because they unfolded in deserts many would never see. Close, because their kings fought in the name of a faith that shaped daily life, a faith that bound them to a wider world. Sermons echoed of martyrs and holy war, while coins minted in Aksum still bore the cross, reminding all that their kingdom stood firm amid the storms of belief. The empire's armies returned, but the strain lingered. What had once been a realm defined by its control of trade and stone now carried the heavy mantle of a Christian power entangled in global struggles. Aksum had risen to meet the challenge, but in doing so, it had stepped onto a stage crowded with rivals whose resources stretched far beyond its reach. The wars across the sands revealed both Aksum's strength and its vulnerability. Its kings could project power across seas, could answer the call of faith with steel and flame. But each campaign reminded them that even an empire crowned with the cross was not immune to the grinding forces of geography, economics, and ambition. And as the Red Sea remained a contested frontier, new winds began to stir from Arabia, winds that would carry a new faith, a new power, and a challenge unlike any Aksum had faced before. The 7th century dawned with a whisper of change, faint at first, like a ripple across calm waters. But in the deserts of Arabia, that whisper swelled into a tide. A new faith, Islam, was rising, its message carried on the lips of merchants, warriors, and prophets. Within a generation, it spread across the sands like fire racing through dry grass. For Aksum, once the master of the Red Sea, this was the beginning of a twilight it could not halt. The Red Sea, lifeline of Aksum's wealth, became contested ground. Arab fleets, swift and relentless, soon dominated its waters. The trade routes that had once funneled ivory, gold, and frankincense into Aksum's harbors were diverted north to Egypt, west to the Mediterranean, and east to the Persian Gulf. The empire that had thrived on commerce now watched as wealth slipped like sand through its fingers. Markets in Aksum's capital grew quieter. The bustling port of Adulis, once filled with the cries of sailors from Rome, India, and Arabia, echoed with silence. Ships still came, but fewer each year, until the harbor that had been the jewel of the Red Sea stood abandoned, its warehouses empty, its docks splintered by neglect. Nature, too, conspired against the empire. The highlands that had once yielded abundant harvests began to feel the strain of overfarming. Soil eroded, fields thinned, and famine struck with merciless rhythm. Climate shifts hardened the land, and the great terraces that fed Aksum's heartland could no longer sustain its people. Hunger gnawed at the edges of empire, weakening the hand that once stretched boldly across seas and deserts. As wealth and food dwindled, so too did the empire's ability to command loyalty. Provinces grew restless. Nobles carved out their own spheres of power, answering less to the crown in Aksum. Rebellions flickered like sparks in dry brush, each one a reminder that the empire was no longer the unchallenged giant of old. The monarchy, once divine and unshakable, became fragile, buffeted by forces it could no longer master. And yet, Aksum was not forgotten. Even as its power waned, its reputation lingered in the minds of distant peoples. Arab chroniclers spoke of it as a Christian stronghold across the sea. Byzantine diplomats remembered it as a kingdom that once marched in defense of the cross. Its coins, scattered across far-off markets, remained silent witnesses of its reach. Aksum's shadow stretched further than its fading armies. One of the most poignant moments in this age of decline was its relationship with the new Islamic world. When the followers of Muhammad, persecuted in Mecca, sought refuge, it was to Aksum that they fled. The king, remembered as the Negus, granted them protection, refusing to betray them despite pressure from their enemies. In Islamic tradition, Aksum became a land of justice, a place where faiths could coexist, at least for a time. This act of mercy ensured that when Islam spread across Arabia and beyond, Aksum was spared the full force of conquest. Yet survival came at a price. Aksum remained isolated, cut off from the main currents of trade and power that Islam now controlled. The grandeur of the old city began to fade. The obelisks still towered, but they no longer spoke of power, they stood as monuments to a past that seemed increasingly unreachable. Churches, once filled with the songs of worshippers, stood in quiet solemnity, their frescoes fading, their walls cracked. The once mighty capital became a city of memory, where the present struggled in the shadow of the past. Archaeological traces tell the story of this decline. The port of Adulis lies buried, its great marketplace is covered by earth. In the highlands, once mighty stone structures were abandoned, and smaller, more modest settlements took their place. The empire did not collapse in a single blow, it ebbed away, slowly, silently, like a great tide receding from the shore. But even in decline, Aksum shaped the world around it. Its adoption of Christianity centuries earlier had planted roots that endured. The faith did not vanish with the empire's wealth, it survived, carried by priests and monks into the highlands, preserved in liturgies and manuscripts written in Guizi. Yet the empire itself faded into shadow, its spiritual legacy endured, glowing faintly like embers in the ashes. For the people who lived through this twilight, the experience must have been bittersweet. Elders could still recall tales of fleets sailing to Arabia, of kings crowned in gold, of merchants returning with treasures from India and Rome. Yet their children inherited hunger, isolation, and a kingdom whose reach shrank year by year. The obelisks loomed over them like ghosts, reminders of a greatness that could no longer be grasped. The empire of Aksum had risen through its command of trade, its embrace of faith, and its daring reach across seas. Now, those very forces, commerce, religion, and geography, turned against it. Islam claimed the seas. The land turned harsh. The cross no longer guaranteed alliances with Rome or Byzantium, themselves weakened and embattled. What had once been Aksum's strength became the weight of its undoing. And yet, this was not the end. From the empire's shadow would rise something new. The memory of Aksum would not vanish, it would transform. The cross would remain, but it would move with the people into the mountains, into hidden valleys, into new centers of power. The empire's shadow, long and dark, would serve as the soil from which another chapter of Ethiopian history would grow. The twilight of Aksum was not merely decline. It was the pause before rebirth, the quiet after the storm, when the land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The highlands of Ethiopia in the 12th century were a world transformed. The empire of Aksum lay buried beneath soil and silence, its monuments half claimed by earth, its port cities abandoned to the sea winds. Yet the faith it had nurtured, the cross it had raised above kingship, endured. Christianity, once the banner of Hosanna, had become the lifeblood of a people. And in this endurance lay the seed of renewal. From the long shadow of Aksum emerged the Zagwe dynasty, rulers who turned their gaze inward rather than across seas. The age of fleets and foreign wars was over. The Red Sea no longer carried their merchant sails. Instead, the mountains became their fortress, and faith their unshakable foundation. In the town of Roa, later known as Lalibela, a vision took shape that would carry the spirit of Aksum into a new age. King Lalibela, whose reign began at the turn of the 13th century, sought not wealth and trade but glory and devotion. Legend says he traveled to Jerusalem, or at least longed to, only to find the holy city lost to Muslim powers. If Ethiopia could not reach Jerusalem, then Jerusalem would be brought to Ethiopia. With this vision, Lalibela ordered the carving of stone churches directly into the living rock of the highlands. The result was nothing less than a miracle of faith and engineering. Entire cathedrals were hewn from single blocks of volcanic stone, carved downward into the earth rather than raised upward. Their walls bore crosses and windows, their interiors filled with columns and arches as precise as any built in Europe or Byzantium. Pilgrims descended stairways carved into bedrock, entering spaces that felt both eternal and otherworldly. In these subterranean sanctuaries, chants echoed, candles flickered against stone walls, and the air itself seemed charged with prayer. Each church was given a name that spoke of its sacred ambition: Bet Medhain Elam, the house of the Savior of the world; Bet Mariam, the house of Mary; Bet Georgius, the house of St. George, its cross-shaped roof visible from above. Together, they formed not just a city of worship but a symbolic map of Jerusalem, recreated in the mountains of Ethiopia. Streams were redirected to flow through the complex, symbolizing the River Jordan. Pilgrims who walked these paths were meant to feel they had stepped into holy ground itself. This was no mere act of architecture, it was a declaration. The Zagwe kings proclaimed Ethiopia the new Zion, a Christian kingdom unbroken by the fall of Aksum, unshaken by the loss of trade, unbowed by the rise of Islam. If the world closed its gates, Ethiopia would carve its own holy city from stone. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela stand as testimony to a continuity that reached back to Aksum. The obelisks had been monuments of kingship, but the churches were monuments of faith. Where once Aksum's rulers proclaimed victory on Stele, the Zagwe kings proclaimed devotion through living sanctuaries. Stone remained the medium, but its message had shifted, from empire to eternity. Life in Lalibela pulsed with religious rhythm. Monks copied manuscripts in Guizi, their hands illuminating texts with bright pigments that glowed even in dim light. Pilgrims walked barefoot across rough terrain, singing hymns as they approached the holy city. Drums and sistra rang out in ceremonies that tied heaven to earth. Every sound, every movement, seemed woven into the fabric of a kingdom that had chosen faith as its crown jewel. Yet the shadow of Aksum still lingered. The Zagwe dynasty could not match the maritime might or far-reaching trade of their ancestors. They ruled a landlocked realm, more isolated than ever, hemmed in by the growing Islamic world along the coasts. Their strength was cultural, spiritual, architectural, but not economic. The legacy of Aksum's global influence remained a memory, while Lalibela's glory was rooted in endurance. Still, this endurance was itself a triumph. In an age when empires rose and fell like shifting sands, Ethiopia held fast to its Christian identity, preserving a heritage few could rival. The churches of Lalibela became not just a sanctuary for the faithful but a symbol of resilience. In their shadow, the memory of Aksum survived, transformed into something that could not be taken by war or drought. The Zagwe dynasty would eventually give way to a new line of rulers claiming descent from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, linking Ethiopia's destiny to a lineage both biblical and legendary. But Lalibela remained, carved into the earth like a permanent heartbeat, reminding each generation that their kingdom had been chosen, preserved, and sanctified. Thus, from the ruins of Aksum rose not another empire of conquest, but a kingdom of faith. Where obelisks once pierced the sky, churches now sank into the rock. Where fleets once sailed the seas, pilgrims now walk the highland roads. The story of Ethiopia turned inward, away from worldly trade, toward the eternal promise of stone and scripture. And yet, even as Lalibela shone as the beacon of Christian Ethiopia, the world beyond continued to shift. New empires rose, new faiths spread, new struggles loomed on the horizon. The rock-hewn churches stood firm, but the currents of history would soon test Ethiopia again, drawing its memory of Aksum into battles for survival and identity in the centuries to come. The land of Aksum today lies quiet, its glory hidden beneath layers of earth and time. The stele still stand, weathered but unbroken, their shadows stretching across fields where farmers guide oxen through furrows. Villages hum with daily life around ruins that once proclaimed the might of kings. Beneath the soil, untouched chambers and broken walls wait in silence, as if holding their breath for the moment they are remembered. The empire that once commanded the seas has become a ghost, woven into the fabric of Ethiopia's highlands yet invisible to much of the world. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments, coins stamped with crosses, pottery etched with symbols of trade, inscriptions carved in Guizi and Greek. Each is a voice from the past, faint but insistent, whispering of a kingdom that rivaled Rome and Byzantium, that spoke in the languages of merchants and priests, that stretched its hand across oceans. Yet much of Aksum remains buried. Adulis, the fabled port, is still a name more than a place, its streets hidden under centuries of silt. Palaces lie undiscovered, their stones scattered, their stories untold. What survives above ground is but the skeleton of a civilization whose soul lingers unseen. For the people of Ethiopia, however, Aksum has never been forgotten. The Church of Mary of Zion stands in the old capital, venerated as the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant. Whether legend or truth, the claim itself is powerful, binding the story of Aksum not only to history but to the sacred. Pilgrims kneel at its doors, monks chant in ancient Guizi, and the line of kings who once traced descent from Solomon and Sheba drew their legitimacy from the soil of this very place. Aksum may have fallen from empire, but it rose as myth, eternal in memory. Standing among the obelisks, one can almost hear the echoes, the clatter of markets filled with ivory and gold, the chanting of priests beneath newly built churches, the cries of sailors rigging ships for the Red Sea. The silence is deceptive, for the earth beneath still holds the heartbeat of empire. Each excavation is a revelation, each shard a reminder that Africa's story is not peripheral but central, that Aksum was no forgotten outpost but a kingdom that shaped the ancient world. And yet, Aksum's greatest legacy is not its stones but its faith. The Christianity embraced under Azana still thrives in Ethiopia, one of the world's oldest continuous churches. The hymns sung in Lalibela echo the chants once heard in Aksum's basilicas. The cross carved on coins now shines from processional staffs carried in tin cat festivals. The empire may have faded, but its spiritual crown endured, passed from generation to generation, binding past and present in an unbroken chain. To walk through Aksum today is to walk through layers of time. Children play among fallen stelae. Shepherds lead flocks across ancient foundations. Tourists gaze at inscriptions whose meanings still challenge scholars. Life continues, yet beneath it all lies the whisper of an empire that waits to be fully rediscovered. The kingdom of Aksum was never truly lost. It lingers in the stones, in the faith of millions, in the legends that shaped Ethiopia's identity. Its ruins do not merely tell of decline, they speak of endurance, of transformation, of a civilization that outlived its own empire by becoming part of its people's soul. And so, beneath the Ethiopian skies, the forgotten empire whispers still, not as silence but as memory, etched into stone, carried in song, alive in the soil that once nourished a kingdom and now keeps its secrets.